Hi, everyone. So, now I'm going to talk about what is known by John Beebe as the critical parent function, or what I like to call the demonstrative function. So, if we look at our model here, the demonstrative function is in the eighth position, it's the last position in the whole structure. That doesn't mean, right? It does not mean that it is the weakest. I've actually been talking about strength in terms of the top, but also strength in terms of the bottom. And actually, I would say that the closer you get to the middle, the more weak a function actually is. And the outer ones, the demonstrative function and the leading function, are actually the most strong. What I mean by strong, I mean very strong, and also got a high amount of energy channeled towards them. So the demonstrative is a very, very powerful function, just as powerful as the leading function. But the main thing is, it is not valued, unlike the leading function. It is not valued. It's not something you enjoy doing for its own sake. It's a bit different in that way. It's also, as you can see here, it is on the right column rather than on the left. Now that means something as well. By being on the right column, right, it is something which is flexible, not stubborn. Now, something is flexible rather than stubborn, but it's also neglected. I like to say that it is something which is quite reluctant in how it is used. It's not intransigent, it's not, I'm not being used except for very specific situations. No, instead it's more like, oh yeah, I'm ready to be used. I'd rather not be used, but if you need to use me, I'm here. I'm ready to be used. However you want me to use, however you want to use me, I'm here. I guess. All right. Try not to use me too often, though. I'd rather not. It's not exactly my most fun thing to do. I've got better things to do, perhaps, than actually be used. So that's the idea of reluctant. It's more flexible. It's more available than the intransigent function of the ignoring or the oppositional, but it still doesn't relish its use. It's when it is used, right, and it's used a lot, I would say, a lot more than people would conventionally think, but it's often used not for its own sake. It's used to help. It's used to support something else. It is, and not in the sense of, oh, I am actually imparting my values and flavoring, say, the leading function. It's more, no, I'm almost helping the helper. What happens is the demonstrative function, unlike the ignoring function, is not kept in the cage. It's out a lot of the time. It's being used, but it's being drawn upon not by so much by the leading function, but actually by the creative function. The creative function often draws upon the help of a demonstrative function to work very fluidly in a sort of fluid interplay to help the person in the type. What does this mean? What does it look like? Well, let's take an ENTP as an example, right? An ENTP, I would say, isn't a type which only uses introverted thinking. They also use plenty of extroverted thinking. They are a type which can think both very structurally and also pragmatically. They can draw from both kinds of thinking and utilize them both at once. But the point is, one will be valued and one will actually be slightly more high in its energy, but not actually valued. So, what does that mean? So ENTPs are going to be types which are going to be very able to be very pragmatic. But what they actually prefer is to be more theoretically structural. And so they'll feed their structures a lot with all sorts of the facts and be very good at taking in new data and using it to revise their structures, but ultimately still being structure oriented in terms of how they build their theories. It's just not going to be so obvious as what you're actually going to be seeing a lot of more, which is their pragmatic problem solving. So this confuses MBTI people no end. It causes them to sort of mix up what TI actually means and think it's sort of a mix of TI and TE. It's because they haven't recognized that the ENTP is using both. This is why the INT, what I'd call INTJ, TI as a leading function, utilizes that without nearly as much TE. And it's hard for people to separate that from what an ENTP does because they haven't really made the distinctions correctly. So yes, there's this idea that the demonstrative function is almost constantly being used by the type. And you'll see it a lot in that type, and you may end up confusing it for, oh, that looks like it's not really extroverted thinking. If you're an ENTP, it's TI, but sort of mixed with, I don't know, extroverted feeling to create this sort of extroverted thinking looking thing. No, it is actually extroverted thinking for the ENTP. It's just not being used for its own sake. It's being used to bolster introverted thinking, which is then supporting extroverted intuition in the ENTP. That's kind of how it's meant to work. So, yeah, it is there. It is continuously ticking over in the background, you could say. That's what the demonstrative function is. Now, BB called it the critical parent. And the idea is that the critical parent is meant to be sort of grumbling and sort of like very critical of that particular area. I wouldn't say that is really right. It's not a serious grumbly area. It's reluctant in how it's used, but the reluctance is about essentially being used for its own sake, which it isn't really done. It's sort of used for other things. So what you'll find is that a type will very much be okay using their demonstrative function. They won't enjoy it for its own sake. They'll subvert it. They'll use and abuse it, and they'll sort of take it for granted in meeting their needs and their obligations, whatever is in their ego block. That's the idea. And they can also use it to kick back and relax in because it's something which is so easy for them and so natural to them that they just won't really pay it much attention and sort of fall back on it whenever they need to. And it actually can give them more energy in that respect. But yeah, it's not something which is a place where you critique things so much. It's more a place where you sort of just kick back, not really take anything very seriously, and sort of relax into it. Like, okay, I do that thing. It's like, for instance, having a supercomputer in your house, right? And instead of using that supercomputer the right sort of way, it's a very, very interesting looking paperweight. That's the idea of the demonstrative function, right? And yet you're using it, just not the way it's meant to be used. It's not important to you in that sort of way. It's used a lot more than your ignoring function. You're not actively suppressing it, but neither are you using it in an intrinsic way. That's the key point. And this is why it's actually quite a bit harder to tell apart, say, ENTPs from ENTJs at times, because the ENTPs will actually be utilizing quite a bit of the TE, but the ENTJ won't be using nearly as much TI because for them, that is going to be their ignoring function and they're going to be suppressing that. So if you look at, say, if you take all the NT types, figure out which one is which by looking for which one is likely to be the ignoring function, the one which is utilized least. That's often quite helpful. But yeah, the demonstrated function is very consistently there. It's constantly on, like the leading function. It's just like the sort of the not so serious, almost class clown sort of younger brother of the king, you can say, who like gets to be the uncle, doesn't have to take any of the responsibility and just have a bit of fun with itself. Right? It doesn't really want to take on much responsibility, hence it's reluctant in its nature, but not intransigent. It's not going to refuse to do what you need it to do. It's actually there as a ready tool to draw from. So yeah, that is the demonstrated function. One thing I'll also say, which is handy, is when it comes to demonstrated function, you start off good at this, right? You're utilizing this quite a lot. You don't enjoy using it so much for its own sake, but you'll take it not so seriously. You might kick back and relax if need be, right? Now, as you grow in confidence, right, this taken for granted area, right, is moved out of. You actually move out of here towards your mobilizing, right? So this is where things get quite interesting. Because remember I talked about the Dom-Tert loop when I was talking about the tertiary or mobilizing function. Well, it's not that you are growing out of your creative or auxiliary function into your mobilizing. That's not accurate at all. You retain your creative function. It's just quite subtle in how it continues to support your dominant leading function. No, what you're growing out of is not your creative or auxiliary. It's actually your demonstrative you're growing out of. The demonstrative is low stakes, low reward. You're not going to muck up in it. You take it for granted. You don't particularly care about it, right? But the mobilizing function, you do care about. You value. You want to show you are good at this thing, even though you're not, right? So it's high stakes and high reward. So as you grow in confidence, you grow out from your demonstrator towards your mobilizing. And when the mobilizing mucks up, as it often ends up doing, you then fall back in onto your demonstrator function, your taken for granted areas, a place of refuge where you can build up your self-esteem and try again, because this is what you actually value. This is not what you value. That is essentially the idea of the demonstrative function, the thing which you grow out of towards the thing which you're not so strong in, but you want to be. So yeah, I hope that's helpful about the demonstrative function. Not a critical parent. I think that's a silly term. I don't see how it actually works very well. It is a flexible, ready to use, but thing you don't really care about and don't take very seriously. That's the demonstrative function. And yeah, look at it in other types. See how, with this information, right? Every type in there with their creative auxiliary function, they also use plenty of the inverse. It's just in the background. You'll see it if you look at it because it should be showing up quite strongly, right? Look at ENFPs, right? If it's actually an ENFP, you'll see plenty of FE as well as FI. They'll be very emotively expressive. If you look at ISFPs, for instance, and I'm talking that in terms of SI and also in the leading function, right? And FE in the creative function, they'll show plenty of FI. If you look at an I and an ISFJ, on the other hand, with FI in the top and SE next, you'll see plenty of SI as well. That is the thing. Look for these fluid interplays between two, and that can help you to identify that demonstrative function working alongside that creative function or auxiliary function. So I hope that helps.